Ray Harryhausen's best-known work involved stories based on the Greek myths, or Sinbad, but several of his films visited other eras. One in particular saw the master of stop motion cross paths with the father of science fiction. Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island was first published in 1874. By this point, he had already gained fame for such works as Journey to the Centre of the Earth, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and, just 2 years previously, Around the World in 80 Days. Due to these titles, and numerous others, he is widely regarded as arguably the greatest science fiction writer in history, although I would argue H.G. Wells' case, especially as he was born in my hometown. Verne's books were instantly popular, and when the age of cinema dawned, they provided material for some of the very earliest films. The Mysterious Island itself was first adapted for the big screen by cinema heavyweights MGM in 1929, although this early talkie deviated from the source material wildly. 32 years later, Columbia released their version of the story with... No, not that one. That was a serial from 1951. Ah yes, that's the one from 10 years later. We had another great score from Bernard Herrmann, now a regular collaborator after The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad and The Three Worlds of Gulliver. Cy Enfield was the director. His biggest success, Zulu, was yet to come, but nonetheless he still had numerous directing credits to his name. Naturally, Ray was in charge of visual effects, as well as contributing to the storyline. And of course we had Charles H. Schneer in the producer's seat, as he had been before and would be again and again until Ray's very last film. The medium of comic books was no stranger to Jules Verne's classic either. Classics Illustrated released their adaptation of it in 1947, and other publishers, such as Marvel, would release their own versions years later. But it would be down to the now familiar publisher of Dell to release an adaptation of Ray's film in issue 1213 of their 4-colour line. It follows the usual Dell traditions, a photo cover, no adverts and no credits, although I have found out that the art is down to penciler Tom Gill with Herb Trimpe inking. This was an interesting team. Tom Gill, although not a well-known name now, was artist for over a decade on Dell's popular Lone Ranger series, a series that ended in 1962, the same year that this came out. He also worked at the New York School of Visual Arts, where he taught illustration. Initially, he did this alongside his work for Dell, and it was on one occasion when he found himself in need of an inker that he asked his students if any of them fancied the job, and it was a young Herb Trimpe that said yes. The real mystery here is the identity of the writer. Other than Jules Verne, why can't they just provide credits? OK, well, let's take a look beyond the photo cover and see what lies in store. As is usually the case with Dell, on the inside cover we've got some black and white stills taken from the film itself. And if I was around in 1963 and I hadn't seen this film yet, seeing these would make me desperate to get down to the local flicks. Pirates, volcanoes, prehistoric bird type things, what's not to love? Although I've got to admit, I always forget that there are actually pirates in this film. It doesn't seem right. It's like they've wandered in onto the wrong set. Anyway, the film itself starts in the middle of a torrential rainstorm in Richmond, Virginia in 1865, and the comic begins at exactly the same point. The artwork, where the storm is concerned, is actually really good, really atmospheric. If people's clothing isn't being tugged at by the winds, then they are leaning into the wind. The rain is slanting down in sheets. Our protagonists, well, most of them anyway, are Union troops that are currently being held by the Confederates, but they plan to break free and use that hot air balloon to make good their escape. They are being held in a basement, and as their jailer brings in a new prisoner, this one a journalist, he falls on a step that's been weakened by the prisoners. In the film, there's a bit of a protracted fight scene because there's more than just the one jailer, but here the single jailer is quickly dealt with. Using the jailer's uniform as a disguise, the prisoners break free and head for the balloon. And as much as the whole balloon thing may seem fanciful, we know that they did actually use them in the Civil War. How? Because it tells us on the inside cover. Dell always liked to give us a little bit extra if they could. And here we have a page dedicated to balloons at war, including the roles that, yes, they did play in the Civil War. Returning to the storyline, we get some really good art, really atmospheric again. This is clearly a rainstorm. This isn't light drizzle or even a shower. It's a maelstrom. The plan seems to be working well enough until they find their first complication, which is a Confederate troop who's actually asleep in the balloon. Now, sadly, we can't hear him talk here. Well, I say sadly, it's probably a good thing, because in the film he was voiced rather unconvincingly by a British actor.
Do you think it's the same pirates Ayrton wrote about in his diary?
I'm really not sure what accent he thought he was doing. Anyway, he is quickly dealt with, and the balloon lifts off. Again, great art. Look at that shading. That Confederate troop is an expert in using the balloon, and he agrees to help them in exchange for his freedom when they eventually land. However, here comes the biggest complication of all, because they don't land, not for another 4 days, as that storm pushes the balloon on. When they do land, it's a rather rough affair. The captain gets thrown overboard, and the basket itself is damaged beyond repair. It doesn't take long, however, for the survivors to discover that things on this new mysterious island on which they've landed aren't entirely normal. The journalist, Mr. Spilett, finds a giant oyster. That's putting it mildly. And it's whilst they are marvelling at that smoke leads them to their captain, who is recovering elsewhere on the beach. But here we have another mystery, because that fire that was producing the smoke wasn't lit by him, nor was it lit by any of the others. And then later on, the crew come across the first monster of this feature, the giant crab. Their battle with this colossal crustacean is quite entertainingly told here. And this is a counter that ends very positively for the group, because not only do they defeat the crab, but then they discover a pool of boiling water, and so they push the crab into it, boil it up, and eat it. Now, it has to be said that this film isn't very big on character development. Who cares, I say. But there is one story arc within it, which is that of the youngest member of the crew. And it's about how he is scared, basically. He was scared to get involved with that giant crab, just as he was scared to get into the balloon when they were escaping from their internment. But the others say to him, yeah, well, we're all scared. It's not a problem, no big deal. But he really feels it. He feels he shouldn't be scared. And he says, it's wrong, it's not right. And now our next 2 characters are introduced, in a way that is slightly different from the film. From the shore, the guys can see 2 women adrift in a boat. Clearly, in the rough waters, they are in trouble. So the crew quickly rescue them just before the boat is destroyed on the rocks. Now, that boat had to be destroyed, because the whole idea of this is that these people are trapped on this mysterious island with no way of getting away from it. So they can't have that boat. And indeed, in the film, they didn't. Well, not that we saw anyway. When we first see the women in the film, they've already been washed up onto the shore, and in fact are unconscious. There is a 3rd member of their crew as well, but he has also been washed up onto shore, but dead. Back to the comic book version, we learn that the women were on board a ship that was hit by a storm at sea, and now acquaintances are made and a home is established. It is established in some abandoned caves. Clearly someone had lived there before, because they have furniture. They also have the remains of that person. Now, here's an interesting decision, editorially. We know, don't we, that Dell comics are good comics. So maybe that's why they chose not to directly show the skeleton of the cave's old inhabitant that was hanging from the roof of the cave. Instead, they show us the shadow of it, the silhouette. Still clearly a skeleton, but I don't know, it just seems odd. Why show that and not the skeleton itself? I don't know. Now, that skeleton is a nod to the fact that, to a degree, this film, but more so the novel of The Mysterious Island, is a sequel. In fact, it's a sequel to 2 other Jules Verne novels. Obviously, well, I say obviously if you already know the storyline for The Mysterious Island, obviously it's a sequel to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, but it's also a sequel to a book called In Search of the Castaways. In that book is a character called Ayrton. Ayrton, who's abandoned on an island. This island. And that skeleton is all that remains of him. In this version of the story anyway. In the book of The Mysterious Island, he does also feature in that, but it's a bit of a happier storyline for him, as he is found still alive and well. We know for a fact that this cave was Ayrton's home, because the protagonists find his journal there, which tells them his story. Sometime later, one of the crew, Neb, finds a chest bobbing around close to shore. Within it, he finds a collection of useful equipment, such as guns, medicine, and a sextant. The captain now uses that sextant to determine exactly where they are, and he determines that they're actually near, well, in terms of the nearest land, to New Zealand, albeit that is nearly 2,000 miles away. In addition to that, there is lettering on the sextant that spells out the name Nautilus. We have all heard of the Nautilus, haven't we? And so too have the crew. They know it as the submarine that belongs to the fantastic scientist Captain Nemo. The Nautilus itself was reported missing 8 years ago, and these items seem to be the remnants of it, although one of the team says it doesn't look like the chest has been floating around for 8 years. Now we encounter what must be the best known of the creatures from this film.
Mary, run! Run!
The prehistoric bird-like creature. And it's a great page of action, just as it was a great sequence in the film. As great as the bird creature is, it is a bit of an anomaly. Originally, the story of The Mysterious Island didn't feature any fantastic beasts. But Ray Harryhausen and Charles H. Schneer wanted to make it more fantastical, and they wanted to introduce dinosaurs to the island. Director Cy Infield didn't really like that idea, so it was adapted and they agreed, okay, they would have giant animals instead, such as the giant crab. The bird creature is a bit of a hangover from the dinosaur idea, and as such, he is the only creature in the whole film, the whole comic, that isn't just a giant version of a normal animal that we're all familiar with. The young lad's story arc is kind of already complete at this point, because he does show his bravery by fighting off his own fears and jumping on the back of the beast and killing it. Never missing an opportunity for a good meal, the creature is, of course, soon cooked to provide food for the whole company. The next day, the 2 youngest members of the group are involved in another well-known scene from the film. Whilst out exploring the island, they discover what seems to be honey trickling down the side of a cliff. On further inspection, they find it's coming from a cave, and within the cave is an oversized beehive. An oversized beehive can mean only one thing: oversized bees. Now in the film, there's a whole subplot about the blossoming romance between these 2 characters. They even speak about marriage. But there's no room for that in this comic book adaptation. There is room for the giant bees though. Whilst those 2 characters are busy being sealed into the giant beehive, their colleagues on the beach have spotted, oh yeah, of course, the pirate ship. And unfortunately, the pirates are coming ashore. In their efforts to escape the giant beehive, the 2 younger characters discover a hidden tunnel that leads to a hidden cave in which is hidden a submarine. Boarding the sub, they find that it is empty, silent, but they also find a nameplate. And that nameplate confirms that they are on the Nautilus. Back on the beach, our heroes are trying to drive off the pirates when something unexpected happens. a powerful explosion blows a hole in the side of the pirate ship and sinks it, with all hands on board. The question is, what caused that explosion? We're about to find out, as now, with all of our main characters reunited on the beach, they are joined by somebody else. Someone that has been on and around the island all this time, but they never even knew. This strangely garbed individual now emerges from the sea and introduces himself as the one and only Captain Nemo. Now, usually in this comic, you can see that efforts have been made to make the characters look like the actors in the film. But when it comes to Captain Nemo, for some unknown reason, they just haven't bothered. Most noticeably, they've given him a shave. Now, we know that sometimes these adaptations are completed before the film is, before some scenes have even been shot. So could it be that they hadn't actually cast the role of Captain Nemo when this comic was being drawn? It's possible, I suppose. Pretty unlikely, though. Actually, on that subject, Columbia actually wanted James Mason to play Captain Nemo. That would have seen him reprise the role that he played in 1954's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. However, ultimately, it was Herbert Lom that was given the job. Captain Nemo explains that it was he who dragged the captain ashore and lit the fire. It was also him that left that chest of useful items bobbing in the water beside their camp. And it was also him who set the charge that sank the pirate ship. He is also responsible for the giant animals on the island. It was his plan to breed these giant creatures and also giant vegetables and other foodstuffs to solve the world's food crisis. No more starvation, no more famine. Now, with the Nautilus, surely they all have the means to escape the island. Well, I'm afraid not. The Nautilus is damaged and will never sail again. However, the pirate ship that is currently underneath the waves, that could be refloated and that could take them all, including Captain Nemo, to safety. How? He has a plan. He says he only damaged a small section of the ship. That is so it could be repaired by using sap from rubber plants. Once that is repaired, air can be pumped into the ship via a bamboo pipeline, and that will refloat the ship. This is science fiction, remember. But how are they going to get to the ship? It is, after all, underwater. Not a problem. The captain has some spare underwater breathing kits. However, they need to get used to using them first. The very next day, they get their first opportunity to practice. This scene is in the film, although in the comic they also throw in a shark for good measure. Something that Captain Nemo quickly dispenses with. So they are now ready to put the plan into action. However, there is another complication. The volcano on the island is erupting. That means they just don't have time to repair the ship. So we have Plan B, which is to use the remnants of the balloon. They won't need to repair the ship if they just place the balloon inside it and fill that with air. The guys grab the balloon, the women assemble the pipeline, and Captain Nemo returns to the Nautilus because that is going to provide the power for the pump. Now, from this point to the end of the film is about 10 minutes. Here, however, we've still got 6 pages left. I did say earlier that the prehistoric bird was the only creature that wasn't just a giant animal. Well, that's not true. It's the only creature on the island that's not a giant animal. But there's another one at sea. As the men arrive back at the pirate ship, they encounter what must be one of Ray Harryhausen's strangest creations. Now, this sequence in the film just doesn't work for me. The creature, for whatever reason, seems too fake. Now, Ray animated it in a slightly different way because the creature is underwater. So he tried to make the creature's movements slower than usual. Maybe it's that, I don't know. But it just doesn't work for me. In the comic, however, we get a good couple of pages of action as the guys try to fight it off and eventually succeed thanks to Captain Nemo's ray gun. With the balloon in place, Captain Nemo begins the pump back on the Nautilus, but it will prove to be one of the last things he ever does. As the pirate ship steadily rises, and the companions push out towards it on a raft they've constructed. The tremors of the volcano cause a large rock to fall and block Captain Nemo's exit from the sub. The crew realise that something is up, but before they can go back and help Captain Nemo, a violent volcanic eruption tears the island apart, leaving nothing to remain except ashes and lava. The mysterious island is destroyed, Captain Nemo is dead, but our heroes have escaped and are now free to return home. So there it is, a perfectly enjoyable adaptation of a perfectly enjoyable film. Ray Harryhausen has claimed that The Mysterious Island was one of his most successful films. I'm not sure exactly how he was measuring that. However, in fairness, it did take around $5 million at the box office on a budget of $2 million. So Columbia Pictures were happy, and they were more than content to back his next venture. The Mysterious Island isn't viewed as a Harryhausen great these days. A common criticism is that it is too episodic, although I don't think it's any more or less episodic than any of his films, and the adventure and indeed mystery of the island make it a good little bit of escapism. All of Ray's films are enjoyable, but there are three that people generally tend to point out as being the very best examples of his work. One was the very first one that we looked at in this series. Another will be the very last that we look at, and the other is the very next one we're going to look at.